What role did the civil rights movement play in the efforts to free South Africa from apartheid? Because obviously those two movements were going on at the same time.
I had the opportunity of speaking to a church congregation, and I outlined the major role that was played by the civil rights movement in South Africa, and remarked about the fact that the struggle here seems to have been mostly led by men of the cloth and various ministers of religion led the campaign against apartheid. We had the history of Randall Robinson, who ran that Trans-Africa institution, which campaigned heavily against apartheid. And various other ministers, particularly of the AME Church, that also played a major role in the struggle against apartheid. And some of the members of that church were actually arrested and imprisoned in South Africa because of the campaign that was led from here. We were greatly inspired by the various campaigns that were led from this country. These campaigns permeated to universities, and a number of institutions, universities played a major role in campaigning against South Africa. And in fact, the imposition of sanctions against South Africa was inspired by the campaigns that were led from this country.
You talk about that inspiration. A few years ago, Desmond Tutu, Bishop Tutu, received an award, a trumpet award. And he talked about looking through the pages of Ebony magazine and gaining inspiration, seeing how well African Americans were doing and how they were able to overcome. So talk about, the sort of kinship between Black Americans and South Africans both fighting for freedom, frankly, fighting racist regimes, Jim Crow in America and apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah, no, that is true. There are great similarities between the two struggles. It is true that those of us who were imprisoned and those of us who were side by some of the great freedom fighters in South Africa know the role that was played by this country. It is true the fact that the campaign against sanctions against South Africa was as a direct result of the activities of the freedom fighters in this country and South Africa.
You talked about earlier, you said men of the cloth in terms of leading this effort.
Men and women, actually.
But I want to get to that because when folks talk about South Africa, I mean, obviously people talk about the importance of Nelson Mandela, but it seems as if the female freedom fighters in South Africa often don't get the same amount of attention. We've heard the exact same criticism in the United States, and so you hear Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and Roy Wilkins, but you don't necessarily hear people talk about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer to the same extent. And so can you speak to that in terms of the role that women played in the movement as well? Because frankly, when Nelson Mandela was in prison all those years, you were the one keeping that light, keeping that going for so many years, keeping the attention on the effort.
Throughout the years, I have tried to explain that, as a matter of fact, it is the women and the children who played a major role during those very difficult years when the entire leadership of the ANC, for instance, and of various organizations were imprisoned. It was the women who carried the banner and fought against the worst racist regime in the world. It was the women who had to eke out a living and look after orphaned children whose fathers and brothers were inside prisons. It was ultimately the children of South Africa during the 1976 uprising who said to the rest of the country, enough is enough. And they said that the most powerful racist regime, they were prepared to expose themselves to the worst brutality any government has ever imposed on its citizens. The leadership in prison was protected by the walls of prison. They knew where their next plate of food came from. They had 3 meals a day. The children, mothers, and their children were the ones who actually bore the brunt of the worst regime that existed on earth.
I'm glad you brought up the children, because right here in Birmingham, when the effort to break down Jim Crow, many of the adults, frankly, did not want to be involved. They were afraid of losing their jobs. In fact, Dr. King had difficulty rallying them, but it was Reverend James Bevel who he assigned to have the children, get them going. And in fact, it was when they busted out of the schools and went down the streets and began to be attacked by dogs and fire hoses, it was in the rest of the country begin to say, as you said, enough is enough. And so today, how vital is it for this generation, whether it's South Africa, whether it's the United States, to understand that they have a role in creating the kind of change that they want to see? They simply can't rely on the adults to do all the heavy lifting.
Well, I think, in fact, our children have told us so in a number of ways. We have also not been very helpful that is the older generation, in reminding our children that before they know where they are going to, they have to remember where they come from. It was our children who sacrificed their childhood and are often today referred to as a lost generation. Far from that, it is not true. Those children gave up their childhood to fight against a racist regime, and thousands of them perished in the war of liberation. It was the youth of our country that left the shores of South Africa, went underground to play a major role in the military wing of the ANC. And today, we have let them down, in the sense that I don't think we have played a major role in guiding them as children. There are various problems, at least in our country, various problems that lead to that transition was not as easy as we thought it would be. We are struggling to try and satisfy the promises we have made as we exhorted the people to vote for the ANC and vote for a better life. We made a lot of mistakes because we didn't know that hoisting the flag of freedom and gaining political freedom without economic freedom was very, very difficult, and it would create difficulties for our future. As a consequence of that, we have not been able to look after our children in a way that promotes their education, that protects the children's rights, and as a result, we see the kind of crimes that are as a result of post-revolutionary struggles throughout the world, where you do not have enough budget to accommodate the children's needs, proper education, proper institutions that cater for the children. So you do have that gap when we are trying to readjust ourselves and create policies that look after our children.
You endured a lot while Nelson Mandela was in prison. Went through a lot in prison. What kept you going in dealing with that? Because you could have done what a lot of folks could have done and said, look, enough is enough. This is just too much for me to bear. What was it that kept you going?
In my specific case, I had to forget about myself and think of myself as the people of South Africa. I was in a difficult position in the sense that when he went to prison, I suddenly realized that I lost my individuality. Up to the point he went to prison, it was Mandela's wife who says this. Mandela's wife says this on behalf of the ANC, and I realized that I had to regain my individuality and develop my own person, because the entire leadership had been arrested, both men and women, and there needed to be a voice to carry that banner, the voice of the people. I did not plan it. I was placed in a situation where there was nobody else to do so. And I soon realized that unless I exposed myself to whatever the then enemy wanted to do to me as the voice of those who were incarcerated, the leadership was going to die in prison. So I deliberately exposed myself to the harshest of the apartheid regime. As a result of that, I was banished to a desolate little village of Brentford. And it is then that I realized that I must have achieved what I wanted to achieve, that individuality, and that they had to contend with at least a voice that will remind them permanently that they are men and women in prison. And apartheid was so vicious at the time. I did not blame any of those who were too afraid. Someone had to carry the banner. And I knew that the reason why I was banished to Brantford was because I was a permanent reminder to the enemy that those men and women were not going to die in prison for as long as there were people like myself outside.
What is your relationship today with your former husband?
That's fine. He remains the father of my children. And as a matter of fact, that had always been our relationship. We were comrades then, and we are comrades right now.
You said comrades.
Yes.
After going through many highs and lows, the freedom, dealing with trials, dealing with folks questioning you, others calling you the mother of the nation, you sort of re-emerge in that back in Parliament, in terms of in Parliament, leadership position with the ANC, still living in Soweto. Yes. Why not just say, I've done my part, I can go relax now, let the next generation take it? Why are you still on the front lines and involved?
Well, I suppose if we had actually reached the ultimate, that we had total democracy, we had fulfilled the promises we made to our people, and that total democracy was defined by satisfying the needs and implementing the policies of the ANC to the extent that the people were leading better lives. But we are still so far from that. I don't consider my job as completed at all. If anything, since Comrade Madiba is in his final years in his life, some of us have to continue for as long as we still have the energy to do so, to fulfill the dreams every one of us fought for.
President Zuma was the third black president, South Africa. Yet folks, you hear folks still, I can hear it in your voice, wrestling with change not moving fast enough.
Yes.
And so how would you assess South Africa today? Should it be further along, or do people need to understand that it took so much to repress, if you will, black South Africans, that it's going to take a lot more to go to the next level?
Well, it is actually all of those things put together. It is extremely difficult for us to tell the masses of South Africa that change will not be as fast as we thought it would be. One of the most difficult things I personally discovered was that it is very easy to make those promises when you're exhorting people to vote for your party, vote for a better life, and You use flowery language. You say you have the people's contract, and working together we shall do more. That is a beautiful language that in fact exhorts people to vote for the ANC. But for me, it has never been enough. I've always felt that guilt that although we have made tremendous strides in our achievements, we could still have done far more than we already have. And we have the weaknesses of every other revolutionary movement taking over from a brutal regime that hoarded the resources of the country and literally mutilated the country because they never thought it would be wrestled from them. With all that, with all those problems, I wish we could have delivered a little more than we already have of the promises we made for our people. And people do not understand that we did gain political freedom, but without economic freedom, that road to freedom is still not yet achievable.
Glad you brought that up. Perfect transition to President Barack Obama. Folks voted for change, but all of a sudden now you hear people say it's not happening fast enough. What's going on?
Can it be?
So your assessment of President Barack Obama, his historic win as the 44th president of the United States, the first African American, and speak to the expectations of people for someone in his position not necessarily being met.
I think it would be the most cruel thing to expect him to have done more than he already has within just 1 year. Generations and generations of oppression, even though this is one of the longest democracies, I think his task is even more difficult because I think the African Americans, for instance, would expect more, and countries like the African continent would expect more from him because he's African American, and realistically it is unfair. It is unfair
Why?
to expect him to have taken such a quick pace in changing what other presidents have taken years and years to develop, and expect him to do that over a year.
So what advice would you give him? Because obviously there are some people who say he should be doing more, not just African Americans, but young people who voted for him. You have folks in red states and blue states, liberals are saying we need more, more, more. What would your advice be to them?
I think he is doing exceptionally well on his own. And I think he should continue doing as he has been doing. And the pace of the changes he will bring to this country are not of his own making alone. No president in any country has a singular power to change the country. I believe even here, like in South Africa, countries are governed by a collective. And it depends entirely on the very people who put him into power to assist him achieve the dreams of those who expect changes from him. As far as we are concerned, he is doing exceptionally well. Like we consider ourselves as doing reasonably well under the circumstances. But at least he's better off because this is a developed democracy, a very old democracy.
Big event coming up in South Africa, the World Cup. What does that mean for your country? And what does it mean for the continent of Africa?
We're walking on cloud nine. We've never been so proud. It's one of the issues that have, in fact, put us on the world map as a country to contend with. We want to show the rest of the world, even older democracies like yourselves, that we are going to do better than you in South Africa in our World Cup.
Spoke about that, and I want to ask about a movie that will be about you. But first, let me deal with, you spoke about the continent of Africa. I was in China recently with the National Urban League, and they talked about spending some $100 billion a year in investment in China. Is the United States and other countries missing an opportunity to invest in Africa? Newsweek recently said that Africa could be the new Asia because of how its economy is growing.
We are a new Asia. We are a new Asia, and I think we have now realized that Africa will pull itself out of its abject poverty itself, and that depending on developed nations, on the G8, the G21, is not really a solution to our problems. And for as long as we are prepared to go for handouts, there will never be that kind of dignity of our continent. We believe that our solution lies in attracting investments ourselves and being recognized as that new Asia which we are.
There have been lots of films done on Nelson Mandela, not many done on you. You've been a part of some of those films. There's a new film that's supposedly being shot starring Jennifer Hudson. I read an account where you took exception to this film being done about you in terms of not reaching out to you. Have the producers reach out to you? Are you going to have any involvement in this film about you, your life, that's supposed to be on the big screen?
Yeah, well, that is the problem with democracy, you know. The very freedom we fought for of the independence of the media, freedom of expression, can be problematic when you think in terms of what people can do with these freedoms. I was never consulted. I have nothing against this particular Jennifer. I'm not young, I don't know much about her. It's my grandchildren who know about her. I have absolutely nothing against her, but I have everything against people still continuing the past I come from. That decisions are taken around me, things are written about one without even as much as the courtesy and decency to consult one and to just inform you that this is what we intend doing, even if, as they say, they don't need my permission. The fact is, I still am an individual, and I still am that person who fought against that kind of attitude where we are regarded as just, you know, part of the furniture of the world. Anyone can just put on the market for sale. Well, I'm not one of those who are for sale, and I would have loved my story to be told in South Africa by South Africans. I'm aware of the many difficulties that exist for our filmmakers. I believe they have problems in sourcing out resources for doing things you people do in Hollywood, and they can never ever reach those aspirations. But I do think it is decent to consult one about one's life, even if they are not going to necessarily write what the truth is about one. But
so I take it you're waiting on a phone call from Spike Lee or Tyler Perry to give you a call to shoot your own film in South Africa.
If they did that, I would welcome them. I would invite them to South Africa.
I certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much. Enjoy your visit here in the United States, and it was a pleasure chatting with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we heard of your great work, that you predicted the results of this country. We know of you, and congratulations for being who you are.
I appreciate it. Thanks a lot. All right, folks, back to that Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. Now, a word from one of our Roland Martin Unfiltered partners. You've heard me say it before, and I will say it again. Write down this website, marijuanastock.org. That's marijuanastock.org. I'm going to tell you why it matters. Legal marijuana has grown to become a $9 billion industry in roughly 6 years. Forbes magazine predicts the market will continue to grow to nearly $50 billion in the next 10 years. So whether you like it or not, legal marijuana is a growing industry, and it is only going to get bigger. Now, if you're an investor, you get it. You look for business models that are easy to understand in industries that are trending up. Our friends at Transatlantic Real Estate made their business very simple. They buy land that supports legal marijuana operations and lease it to high-paying tenants. So you are investing in the landlord of a licensed marijuana farm. Stop working so hard for your money. Let your money start working for you by investing in the legal cannabis industry. You can invest as little as $300 up to $10,000. But you can't wait. This crowdfunding opportunity is only available for a few more days. They say that you either make things happen, watch things happen, or sit around wondering what happened. Don't be the person watching and wondering. Don't let another investment boom get away from you. It's time to make something happen for you, your finances, and your family. And don't forget my pro tip. To be included, you must complete and confirm your application. And be sure to complete the process. Go to marijuanastock.org. That's marijuanastock.org. Get in the game, folks. Do it now before time runs out. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video. Reverend lost a great freedom fighter in Winnie Mandela.
An exceptional one. Up there with the giants, the male giants and the crewmen of that group. She's way up there because for 27 years, that Nelson Mandela was in jail. Most folks had never seen him, never heard of him. The voice and the face was Winnie Mandela's face. She had the burden of being the wife, the mother, and the freedom fighter, and often because she was outspoken, exiled. She never left South. She didn't come out. She didn't come to Europe. She didn't come to America. She stayed in South Africa. So she's a huge force for good, and no one can ever forget the iconic picture that Sunday. They came out of jail holding hands, freeing the jailer. But the first lady of New South Africa was Winnie Mandela.
And the reality is, you talk about folks seeing her and hearing from her, but she was the one who kept his name out there. When others were, well, we don't think he's ever going to get out, I mean, she was constantly there and actually gave such inspiration to those young black South Africans.
Well, African National Congress, Oliver Tambo was in exile in Europe and in America. Ramaphosa was in Europe. Mbeki was in Europe. The key leaders were outside the country. She never left the country. She stayed in. And not a silent wife, but a vocal wife who was in fact exiled and punished while in South Africa and was an organizer and did press conferences. The whole world saw South Africa through the eyes of Winnie Mandela.
You met her many times, of course, and I interviewed her in 2010 for such a strong figure. She also was very playful. I mean, she
a very delightful person. She never lost a sense of fun, a sense of joy, and a sense of accomplishment. I think that when the ANC came back home, that she deserved a more exalted place than she received, because when they were away in small settings describing how terrible things were, they were not home. Their punishment was they were not home. She never left the belly of the beast.
One of the things that also I think jumps out is when you talk about that treatment. I mean, obviously she went through a trial when she was convicted. That really soured a lot of people on her as well. But there are others who I've talked to who said you cannot take away from just the fierce nature in terms of how she opposed.
Put her own trial soured a lot of people. If anybody should have come out of that, you know, Lincoln said after 246 years of slavery, all those who've been enslaved are now free. And she was a freedom fighter. She fought that beast, the same beast that killed people and made blacks walk on the other side of the street and made them live in slums and huts. She was a freedom fighter. And so she gets some points for being a veteran of that war, post-traumatic syndrome.
Do you think that when you begin to, I mean, obviously Nelson Mandela passed away and there was such this international outpouring, a focus on him, that folks like Winnie Mandela are too often forgotten? To me, it's no different than when folks talk about, even us being in Memphis, they talk about Dr. King and all he said, all he did, but he can't do any of that without Coretta Scott King.
Or Jim Lawson, or Billy Kyles. There was a body of people who did the inviting. And of course, when he came, and he would often say his staff was the ground crew. He was a pilot, or they were the foot soldiers. He was a leader. He always appreciated the fact that None of the stuff was lonely and only and unilateral. There was always a team of us involved in that situation. But her role was even more different. Dr. King was on the way 27 years in jail. He was away 27 years. No one could see his face. They meant for him to die in jail. Her voice and seeing her abused shook the whole world.
And what's interesting is when he came here, he was on that banned list of the United States. I remember even she had to get special dispensation to travel to the U.S.
She was on the terrorist list because she resisted the South Africa's apartheid, and the South African apartheid leadership was an American ally in our foreign policy. So you can't, the only one who stands above her, the symbol of that struggle, is Winnie Mandela. Even Mr. Tambo, who was the president in exile, he was in exile. He was living in Europe. He was living in America. He was traveling around the world. Winnie never left the belly of the beast. And she took the hit. She took the exile with her children. They saw their mama exile. And she kept on fighting back. And so I will forever cherish memories of her and what she did. And some of us know that I will have to go to South Africa to her funeral. We'll have to go.
Last question. I was chatting with some folks, still unsure if any of the living U.S. presidents will be here in Memphis. Still waiting to find out. Should they be here? Should a Trump be here?
He should be. He's not likely because he is so opposed what Dr. King stood for. After all, his attorney general took the position that the Voting Rights Act was an intrusion on states' rights. They've done everything they could to unravel the civil rights agenda Dr. King put forth. The Department of Education chief, DeVos, never been to a PTA meeting, wants to displace public with private schools. Ben Carson wants to take the word discrimination out of the mission of HUD. And he's trying to unravel. He's not going to be successful. So we're finding that Dr. King left with us a weapon, the vote. And with that vote, we're winning victories in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Virginia and in Alabama. We're going to win more this coming year. He left us some with which to fight. But Trump is not likely to come, and he would not be received very well if he came, in my opinion. But there's no reason why others should not come.
You mentioned Carson. 8 days after Dr. King was killed, assassinated, they finally passed the Fair Housing Act. And to have the Secretary of Carson take the actions that he's taken, I mean, that's bothering to a lot of people. In the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act.
There was a major article in the New York Times last Thursday on not only HUD, what people don't think of is that he refused to put public housing in white and Republican areas. So he reinforces housing segregation, which affects stacking and packing of districts, which affects the tax base, which affects education. So that his role as a factor in public housing, working against the interests of our people, in the name of pride. We get too much pride sitting next to white people. The fact is, if you put several thousand public housing in a given area, it affects the behavior of that district. The whole idea of leaving segregation was to modify the behavior of those who could, by the extension, be extremists against our interests. And so what Ben Carson doing is a source of shame. And this was he and Clarence Thomas on the very same page. And we deserve better. They are apostates.
Monday, I get a text message about the passing of Winnie Mandela. And I ran to Reverend Jackson, so I quickly interviewed him. And then when I saw the schedule that you were going to be here, I said, I know he has something to say about Winnie Mandela. Because your paths surely have crossed.
She was an extraordinarily courageous woman. She kept his memory alive when he was in prison. And she was not well treated while he was in prison. And it was tough for her. But she stood her ground. She was a remarkably strong woman. And I met her several times, on my visits to South Africa. And she was always warm and concerned about how the struggle was going stateside, and a good person, and very smart. And as I said before, I keep coming back to it, extremely courageous.
One of the things that I interviewed her in 2010, one of the questions I asked her was the role that women played, and I compared it to this, to the civil rights movement, and how women did not get the credit they deserved. And she said the women and children were huge in taking down apartheid.
Well, I'm not surprised. She is the best testimony for that. She knew better than I did. And so if she said it, I believe it.
You were running Trans Africa, and obviously apartheid in South Africa was at the top of that agenda. And I remind people what those Polaroid workers did to really kick this divestment thing off. I interviewed Ron Dellums, and he said, we didn't know about what was happening in South Africa until they came and told us. And so when you think about Winnie Mandela, Reverend Jackson said the key is, he said, unlike a lot of the other ANC leaders, she never left. She stayed in that country. She faced down those white racists who were in power, who were on those police forces, and who brutalized her.
She might easily have left, but she didn't. And that took some courage to decide to stay. Many left the country during that period, but she didn't. That's the best evidence of what she was made of.
She's called the mother of South Africa, but the shine, if you will, the trials she went through took a lot of that off. Divorcing Nelson Mandela took a lot of that off. But I still say you cannot deny her significance in terms of him getting out of prison and that country becoming free from under colonial rule, from under white rule.
I was on the NBC telecast the day that he came out of prison, and she walked out with him, and how uplifting that stroll that they took together out of that place. She was an incredible woman, and I was always very proud of her, as I was of him, and that they made, I thought, an extraordinary couple. Now, if a relationship doesn't survive 27 years of apartness, well, that's entirely understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Not many marriages, particularly a marriage under the pressure that hers was under, would reasonably have a good chance of surviving that. So I don't think that's any kind of mark against her on the record,
mm-hmm.
or nor him. It's a long time.
First of all, a lot of marriages don't last 27 years. Talk about being apart 27 years.
Absolutely.
I gotta ask you this here. I was texting someone, and we were talking about MLK 50. We were talking about the condition Memphis is in, black African Americans with contracts and workers. And I said, you know what? We don't use the word apartheid to describe what we went through. I said, frankly, we should. We talk about black freedom movement, civil rights movement, we talk about Jim Crow. I said, but the reality is, when you really begin to sit down and look at completely being frozen out of so many sectors, looking at education and so many different things, I said, I use this example in my speeches that if you talk about 1619, 244 years of slavery, Reconstruction, nearly 100 years of Jim Crow. So I said, if you use 19 King is killed in 68. I said, if you use the marker of 1970, I said, black folks have only been free in this country for 48 years.
When you count backwards from the 1964 Civil Rights Act to the landing of 20 enslaved people in the belly of a slave ship at Jamestown Landing, we come up with a figure of 331 years. Now, the Jewish Holocaust was 12 years. Our Holocaust was much, much longer than that, in which we lost everything. I was speaking today about having seen Africans arrive on our shores as chattel property. And they were Africans nonetheless, who brought cultures, who brought collaborative cultures, who brought languages, who brought religion, brought all of that with them when they came. When I was born in 1941, I was a Negro. How could that happen? We were Africans in the 1600s, and all of a sudden, we're Negroes. It means that we
You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it.
First African Baptist. Until I learned that it was founded by freed and enslaved people. And but the terrible thing that you do to a people, cutting them off from their cultures and everything else, their history, their story of themselves, is that you take people and make them really totally property. And that property is more valuable to you and more controllable if that property has no contact with any past. So you don't know anything about who you were and what you were supposed to do. I mean, just consider Frederick Douglass under the slave codes that were in place at the time. If Frederick Douglass had been caught, if he had been caught, the first time he would have been whipped. The second time, he would have had an aura blazed into his cheek. The third time, he would have had his ear cut off. And the fourth time, he would have been castrated. That was what happened to thousands upon thousands of people, after all, in the transatlantic passage, the Middle Passage. Something close to 2 million people died. Now, if this is not a Holocaust, I don't know what is. And at the end of which, you get absolutely nothing nothing. And we're talking today at this conference about closing the gap.
Right.
That there are social procedures right now going on at this very moment to make sure that you don't close that gap.
Right. And then when you talk about got nothing, then when those free slaves fought through that and began to acquire land, it's stolen.
Yeah.
It's taken away.
Yeah.
And I then take it even further, so that if you take this thing up through 1990s, you get the 2000s, then you begin to look at black home ownership. Then what happens? 2008 hits, home foreclosure crisis. 53% of black wealth wiped out.
Subprime.
So the history is, at every point when black folks here snatched, here snatched,
Yes.
here snatched,
Yes.
and it's this constant having to start over. And so then people go, well, why your neighborhoods got crime? Why is this? Why is that?
Well, you know, the other thing we lost at the same time, you've lost all memory of who you were.
Yes.
And that's important. I mean, I went to see Queen of Sheba. And the queen was played by Gina Lord Brigida. It's, what? All kinds of things like that. I had no idea at the time when I was a child that there had been black pharaohs in Egypt, one of whom built the Great Pyramid. Or the hidden, the 11th century, 12th century rather, churches in Ethiopia, carved out of solid stone. I mean, so many extraordinary things to see that we had no idea. That Moses' wife, Zipporah, was Ethiopian. We just had no idea of our own story. None, zilch. And that wasn't an accident.
Which is why, last question, which is why when you see this reaction to Black Panther, it is this, to me, it is the equivalent of 1977, the reaction to Roots. But the thing that I keep telling people, folks like, you know, it's made $1 billion. I just got a text in it. Saw a tweet and just surpassed Jurassic Park as the number 4 all-time grossing film. And folks are talking about the sequels. And what I keep saying is, if you only focus on and know about Wakanda, but then don't go to the next step and begin to research the real kingdoms, not just the ancient kingdoms, but then if you don't bring it present day to realize 7 of the 10 fastest economies in the world right now are African nations, then that just becomes a moment where we get hyped about a movie, but not reprogramming this.
Yeah.
Because that's the key. You got to reprogram this.
I mean, just think about the great Malian Empire. We knew nothing about this stuff. Zip. And to make it all worse, Carter G. Woodson wrote about this, that many of the leading black institutions in this country, and he wrote this in 1936 or 39, I think. He wrote that these institutions teach courses on ancient Europe, but no courses on ancient Africa.
Right.
And why aren't they doing this? And so we've inhaled the stuff.
Yes.
You know?
Yes. It's in our DNA. It's in our makeup.
It's in us.
And so it requires reprogramming. It requires going through that to say, let me remove and then let me replace. And I just think that's just one of the things that, for me, it has to happen. Otherwise, we are still operating on his story and not history.
That's right. That's right. And what we were talking about today is, the point is that while we lost the value of our hide, and that amounted to a lot of money, we're talking about the value of the enslaved people themselves, something like $4 billion. That was as much as manufacturing and railroads put together in the country. It was the largest asset in the country. But that seemed to pale when compared to what you have done to engineer new people.
Right.
To cause them to almost despise themselves.
Yes.
That is the biggest crime of all.
You want to support Roland Martin Unfiltered? Be sure to join our Bring the Funk fan club. Every dollar that you give to us supports our daily digital show. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered daily digital show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real as Roland Martin Unfiltered. Because guess what? We come back live January 3rd. The blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Hello. Y'all want some of this? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. There's only one show out here, folks, in the digital world that's focused on you. Because here's the piece. I ain't afraid of Fox News. Come back live January 3rd.